Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. This is our second class of this series on the wisdom of emptiness, module 12, I think, of the Discovering Buddhism course. And I noticed that just at the end of last week's class, somebody wrote a question in the chat box about various versions of Perfection of Wisdom sutras, and which I would recommend. I mean, there are not many actually translated into English, especially the really long ones. Edward Kanza did translate some of the longer ones. But I haven't had a chance to read them. And we do have lots of different translations of the Heart Sutra, the Heart of Wisdom Sutra. And I was thinking anyway that it would be good to recite that at the beginning of our class. So we'll be doing that today. We'll recite the Heart of Wisdom Sutra. I hope Heather got that one, that it'll be put up on the screen for everyone to recite. And following that, we'll do our regular prayers. So if you've attended teachings by Tibetan lamas, they often recite the Heart Sutra at the beginning of prayers, teachings. And it's considered a good way to clear away any interfering energies that might be around that might interfere with the teachings. But it's also just very auspicious and very virtuous to recite it, even if we don't fully understand it, to get those positive imprints on our mind. And so what I'm sharing with you today is just a slightly different version than what is found in the FPMT prayer books, because I just discovered recently there's a couple of words missing in that one. They're not extremely crucial to the meaning, but anyway, this version I'm sharing with you does have those missing words. So yeah, there's lots of different versions, and different people might prefer different versions, but it is important to try to have a complete version, because actually the Chinese and possibly the Japanese, I don't know, the version that they use isn't really complete. There's a whole section missing at the beginning. And it usually just starts with Avalokiteshvara's answer to the question, which is the most important part of the sutra. But it's nice to have the beginning part as well, which is there in the Tibetan version. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about that sometimes, that he noticed as well that the version used in the Chinese tradition is not complete. So it's good to try to have a complete version, and also one that's well translated. So anyway, this is the one that I like. I've been reciting it for many years and I've memorized it, so I recite it every day. Okay, so let's begin with that recitation. It'll be up on the screen for you to follow. Thus have I heard, at one time the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha on Masked Vulture's Mountain, together in one method with a great assembly of monastics and a great assembly of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Blessed One was absorbed in the concentration of the countless aspects of phenomena called profound illumination. At that time also, the superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, was looking perfectly at the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, perfectly looking at the emptiness of inherent existence of the five aggregates also. Then, through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said to the superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, how should a child of the lineage train who wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? Thus he spoke, and superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, replied to Venerable Shariputra as follows. Shariputra, whatever son or daughter of the lineage wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should look perfectly like this, subsequently looking perfectly and correctly at the emptiness of inherent existence of the 5 aggregates also. Form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form. Form also is not other than emptiness. Likewise, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, like this, all phenomena are merely empty, having no characteristics. They are not produced and do not cease. They have no defilement and no separation from defilement. They have no decrease and no increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. There is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no tactile object, no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so forth, up to no mind element, and also up to no element of mental consciousness. There is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance, and so forth, up to no aging and death, and no exhaustion of aging and death. Likewise, there is no suffering, origin, cessation, or path, no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and abide in the perfection of wisdom. Their minds have no obstructions and no fear. Passing utterly beyond perversity, they attain the final state beyond sorrow. Also, all the Buddhas who perfectly reside in the 3 times, relying on the perfection of wisdom, become manifest and complete Buddhas in the state of unsurpassed, perfect, and complete enlightenment. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the equal to the unequaled mantra, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, since it is not false, should be known as the truth. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is proclaimed. Tayata gate gate, pargate, parasam gate bodhisoha. Shariputra, a bodhisattva, a great being, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like this. Then the Blessed One rose from that concentration and said to Superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva, the great being, that he had spoken well. Good, good, O child of the lineage, it is like that. Since it is like that, just as you have revealed, the profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced in that way, and the Tathagatas will also rejoice. When the Blessed One had said this, the Venerable Shariputra, the Superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the Great Being, and that entire assembly of disciples, as well as the worldly beings, gods, humans, demigods, and spirits, were delighted and highly praised what had been spoken by the Blessed One. Okay, so now, while reciting the prayers, if you wish, you can imagine the Buddha in the space in front of you. And you can imagine many other Buddhas and Bodhisattvas around him, around us, looking at us with loving kindness and compassion, ready to help us in whatever way they can, help us especially to develop our wisdom and other good qualities like love and compassion, so that we can progress along the path and finally reach enlightenment. And if you wish, you can imagine all other sentient beings around us taking refuge along with us, and receiving the benefit of reciting these prayers along with us. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence and turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun, and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Manda Kamniyatayami. So now we'll recite the mantra of the Buddha a few times. And while reciting it, imagine light flowing from the Buddha, from his heart, from his whole body, flowing into oneself, and all other living beings. We all get filled with this light, and it purifies our negative karma and defilements like greed, hatred, ignorance, other afflictive emotions. It also nourishes our positive potential, our Buddha nature, so that that can develop, increase more and more, and bring us quickly to that state of enlightenment, just as the Buddha attained. Taya ta om muni muni maha munaye soha. 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 So before we move on, check your mind, your motivation. And just in case you don't already have a positive motivation, an altruistic motivation, bring into your mind as much love and compassion, positive thoughts, feelings towards other people, other beings, as you're able to. Really feel the wish to help others as much as you can, to relieve suffering and the causes of suffering, negative states of mind like anger and greed and ignorance, and to increase happiness and peace and the positive states of mind that are the cause of those: compassion and love, generosity and wisdom, understanding the true nature of things. So really try to feel the wish to increase those positive qualities, positive ways of thinking and living in other people and other beings. And to be able to help others in those ways, we need to do it ourselves. So we need to reduce our own suffering and its causes and increase happiness and peace and the causes of those in our own minds. So feel the wish that you will learn something in this class this morning that will help you in that way, to increase the positive, decrease the negative, so that you can be of benefit to other people, other beings. And if you're comfortable with the idea, the aspiration to become fully enlightened, a Buddha, to be able to help others in the best possible way, then you can bring that in as well. Okay. So last week, I gave some background information about the topic of emptiness. I spoke about the Four Noble Truths and the Two Truths, which is His Holiness the Dalai Lama recommends that for newcomers to Buddhism, it's good to start with those topics. And we also looked briefly at the three higher trainings, the main practices needed in order to attain liberation from suffering. And I also gave a bit of background information about the teachings on emptiness, where they come from, and a little bit about the lineage and different schools, and how there are different schools of philosophy in Buddhism that have different ways of explaining this topic of emptiness, or also called selflessness. And in the Tibetan tradition, or at least in the Gelug tradition, I haven't studied that much the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism, but mainly familiar with the Gelug tradition, they regard the Madhyamaka Prasangika school as having the most accurate explanation of things. So they favor that school. And according to that school, the Prasangika school, emptiness means emptiness of inherent existence. It's also sometimes called true existence, or objective existence, or independent existence. So there's lots of different synonyms for inherent existence. Inherent existence is actually a way of existing that is false. It doesn't exist. Things don't exist that way. And yet we see things as existing in that way, and we tend to believe in that way of existing. So what we need to understand is things are actually empty of, or they lack that mode of existence. So that's how emptiness is explained in the Prasangika school. We're not going to go into other meanings of emptiness. According to other schools, that would take too much time. It's too complicated. But just to keep in mind that there are other meanings to that word emptiness. other than how it's explained in the Prasangika school. And according to the Prasangika school, emptiness is a quality of everything that exists, including our own self, I, and our body, our mind, other people, their bodies and minds, and all the other things in the world, in the universe. Whatever exists has emptiness as its true way of existing, the actual way that things exist. And the reason it's so important to understand emptiness is because if we don't understand emptiness, we are seeing things in a wrong way, in a mistaken way. And that's a very damaging mistake because it's the source of all our suffering. All the suffering we have in our own lives and all the suffering in the world, all of the suffering and problems are rooted in ignorance that doesn't see things as they really exist. And so it's really important, if we want to eliminate suffering, free ourselves from suffering and help others be free of suffering, we need to clear up that mistake. We need to see things correctly as they do exist, which is empty of inherent existence. Okay, so today we're ready to dive into emptiness. So on the that set of notes, we're on page 2, middle of page 2. Yeah, so Roman numerals 3, understanding emptiness. Okay, so under that, letter A says, emptiness can also be called selflessness, and there are 2 types. So the term selflessness is often used in teachings and texts. So one of my teachers said, emptiness and selflessness are pretty much the same. They are interchangeable, those 2 terms. And the 2 types of selflessness, number 1 is selflessness of persons, selflessness of persons. So that is with respect to persons. So persons in Buddhism aren't just human beings, but any living being. So it includes animals, insects, all the beings in the animal realm, and then other realms like hungry ghosts and gods and hell beings and so on. So all living beings, including Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and so on. So any living being is a person. Okay, so one type of selflessness or emptiness is with regard to persons. And this type of selflessness is asserted by all 4 Buddhist schools. So all the Buddhist schools agree that there is such a thing as selflessness of persons, although they don't all explain it in exactly the same way, but they do at least agree there is such a thing as selflessness of persons. And so according to the Prasangika school, this would be the emptiness of inherent existence of living beings, oneself, others, and everyone else, all living beings. The second type of emptiness is called the selflessness of phenomena, and phenomena refer to everything other than persons. Although strictly speaking, persons are also phenomena. The word phenomena it is just simply refers to anything that exists. Whatever exists is a phenomenon. So persons are phenomena. But here in this division, this way of dividing up selflessness, phenomena refer to everything other than persons, all things that exist besides persons. And selflessness of phenomena is explained only in the 2 Mahayana schools, which are the Chittamatra or mind-only school and the Madhyamaka, middle way school. So only those 2 schools talk about selflessness of phenomena, not the others. But again, they explain it in different ways. How they explain selflessness of phenomena isn't always the same, but in the case of Prasangika, which we're focusing on, Selflessness of phenomena refers to the emptiness of inherent existence of all phenomena other than persons. So that includes things like our bodies and all the parts of our bodies, our heart, our brain, our bones, and so forth. And also minds. So our minds are also phenomena, and they are also empty of inherent existence. And then things outside of ourselves like cars and computers and trees and food and samsara and nirvana, okay, whatever exists, you name it. If it's other than persons, that all those things fit into phenomena, and they are all empty of inherent existence. So in approaching emptiness and trying to understand emptiness, it's recommended that we start with persons. And in particular, we start with our own self, our own sense of I, me, and look at that, try to understand emptiness with regard to our own self. Because it's said that it's easier. I can't remember if I talked about this last week or not, but anyway, they say it's easier to understand selflessness of persons than it is to understand selflessness of phenomena. Although what they mean by that is it's easier to understand how our own self, I, me, is empty of inherent existence than it is to understand our aggregates, our body and mind, to be empty of inherent existence. They say that's more difficult to understand. But I don't know if that's something absolute, or maybe that's the case for most people, but there may be exceptions to it. I don't know. But anyway, that's what's recommended, that we start with our self, I, me. And once we can realize emptiness with one object, then it's very easy to understand the emptiness of anything else that we might turn our attention to. So another person, or our body, our mind, and so on. So that's what the Gelug teachers recommend, that we start with our own self, I. And before jumping into emptiness, it's important to understand how we do exist, how a person, oneself, others, and so on does exist conventionally. Because, so that's letter B, I'm moving on now. Because sometimes people get the misunderstanding that emptiness means non-existence, nothingness. It kind of sounds like that. I can understand how they would get that idea. So some people think emptiness means I don't exist, you don't exist, nobody exists, nothing exists. That isn't the meaning of emptiness. That's a misunderstanding. And it's actually quite a dangerous idea to fall into. Just to give an example, when I first went to India and I was studying at the Tibetan library in Dharamsala back in the early 70s, there was a relatively small number of Western people there at the time. And people told me there was this one Western woman. I didn't actually meet her, but she had been studying and meditating for a while, and she thought she understood emptiness. Maybe she even thought she realized emptiness. But her understanding, her idea of emptiness was nothing exists. So she got into this state of mind where she thought, I don't exist, my body doesn't exist, my mind doesn't exist, nobody else exists, nothing else exists. She really believed that, and she became kind of like a vegetable. She was just not doing anything because she believed nothing exists. So if nothing exists, there's no point to do anything. So she became, kind of vegetative, and they eventually had to take her to the hospital, and I think eventually a psychiatric hospital, because she just wasn't functioning, wasn't taking care of herself, and so on. So that's an extreme case of what can happen if you misunderstand emptiness, thinking it means nothing exists. And also it's, the Heart Sutra that we read earlier, if you read the Heart Sutra, you can think, oh, but right here in the Heart Sutra, it says, there is no eye, no nose, no tongue, no body. So it sounds like that's what the Buddha is saying, but that is a misunderstanding. You have to learn what the real meaning of the Heart Sutra is. It's not saying things don't exist. They don't exist inherently. That comes right at the beginning. The phenomena not existing inherently. And so then once it was said once, it's not necessary to repeat that all the time, that things don't exist inherently. So you need to apply that qualification when it says there is no I and so forth. It means there is no inherently existing I. That's the meaning of that. But it's possible people might just read that sutra and get the wrong understanding and then end up like that woman. So be very careful to not go to that extreme way of thinking. Another danger is if you do think emptiness means nothing exists, then you throw away karma, the law of cause and effect. And apparently that is something that happened in the past because we're warned about that. Because if you think, oh, there's no I, there's no you, there's no me, there's no nothing, so that means anything goes. I can do whatever I want. There's no karma. If I get angry at you, I can kill you. You're not there anyway. You don't exist anyway. So if I kill you, well, no problem. So apparently some people can fall into that mistake, which is very wrong. And then you're actually creating negative karma. You're creating more suffering for yourself rather than lessening your suffering. So there are dangers to misunderstanding emptiness. And so that's why it's very important that when we do study emptiness, we understand that we are not denying the conventional nature of things, how that things do exist conventionally. Now, what that means will become more clear later, what it means to exist conventionally. It's not that easy, but anyway, we do exist. So this point here is looking at how a person does exist conventionally. So there's a different definition of a person. A person is the I that is imputed in dependence on 4 or 5 aggregates. So you, me, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Dalai Lama, and so on, all persons. What is a person? The person that exists is just what is imputed in dependence on or in relation to 4 or 5 aggregates. And we'll look at the aggregates in case you're not familiar with those. So apparently all the Buddhist schools will agree with this definition of a person. All agree that a person is just imputed in dependence on 4 or 5 aggregates. And the reason that it says 4 or 5, most beings have 5 aggregates, but there are certain beings, there's a realm called the Formless Realm, where the beings don't have a body. They just have mind in a state of meditation. That's the result of developing very strong concentration and then developing certain states of mind. They end up in that realm. But most beings have 5 aggregates. So we'll look at the 5 aggregates. And before that, the second bullet point under that says 4 terms that are synonymous are person, self, I, and being. So those terms are used in Buddhist texts, philosophical texts, and they all have the same meaning. They're all interchangeable or synonymous. Person, self, I, being. And you might think, well, wait a minute. The term I only applies to me, and others aren't I, others are them. But remember, they think they are I. Everybody, when it comes to our own self, we all use the word I. So from our own point of view, we are I. So in that way, everybody is I from their own perspective. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so the 5 aggregates, just quickly, because probably most of you have heard this before. So this is a Buddhist way, although I've heard it was actually already in existence before the Buddha. It was used by Indian philosophers. So it's just a way of dividing up a person, a being. So the form aggregate is our body. The other 4 aggregates are all mental. They're all different aspects of our mind. Feelings is a mental factor, one aspect of our mind that experiences an object as pleasant, unpleasant, or neither. It's not the same as emotions, like the word we use in English, emotions. Feelings in Buddhism isn't the same as emotions, because emotions can be much more varied. But feelings is just a more basic reaction or way of reacting to things. Whatever we see, hear, smell, taste, feel with our body, or think, every single one of our 6 types of consciousness, there's always a feeling that accompanies it. When we look at something beautiful, we probably have a pleasant feeling. When we see something ugly, like a pile of garbage, we probably have an unpleasant feeling. And then neutral feeling, I think of, when you just look at a wall, a completely plain wall, then you don't feel pleasant or unpleasant, but just neutral. So feelings is happening all the time, every single experience we have. And then discrimination is also a mental factor. And this is also ever present. It's there with every experience we have. And discrimination is that which enables us to tell one thing from another. For example, we can distinguish blue and red, a cat, a dog. So discrimination is able to notice specific characteristics, unique characteristics of objects, to be able to distinguish one from another. And then number 4 is compositional factors. Sometimes it's called, I don't know, there are other terms for it, but that's the one I use. So this includes all the other mental factors other than feelings and discriminations. So there's many mental factors. In the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, we usually study 51 mental factors. Other traditions have 49, but actually there's more mental factors than that. So these are all different aspects of our mind that have different functions, and they enable us to interact with, to experience objects in different ways. Some include emotions, both negative emotions like anger, attachment, jealousy. So those are mental factors. But we also have virtuous mental factors such as faith and love and compassion. And then there are other mental factors that are neutral, neither virtuous nor non-virtuous, but like mindfulness, for example. Mindfulness is a mental factor. So that's a very interesting study. I think Venerable George is teaching that right now in Thupta Norbuling, mind and mental factors. So anyway, all the other mental factors are included in the 4th aggregate, and the 5th aggregate, consciousness, includes the 6 types of main minds, primary minds. So that means we have 6 different ways of knowing things. Seeing with our eyes, hearing with our ears, smelling with our nose, tasting with our tongue, feeling sensations in our body. Those are the 5 kind of physical types of mind. And then the 6th one is the mental consciousness, which includes all of our thoughts and our memories, our dreams, fantasies, our emotions, and so forth. So those are the 6 different ways of knowing. So each moment of our experience, each moment of our mind consists of one of the 6 types of main minds, one of those 6, plus a number of mental factors accompanying it. And that's how we know objects. We perceive and experience objects. So anyway, just roughly, this could be a whole study in itself, the 5 aggregates, but what we are, what any living being is composed of these 5 things. And each of the 5 aggregates in turn is composed of its parts. Okay, body has many different parts. Consciousness has different parts, and so on. So we are like a combination, a collection of physical and mental parts or components, always changing. Every single bit of us, both our body and our mind, is changing constantly. It's impermanent, doesn't stay the same from one moment to the next. And then in relation to this particular set of aggregates, body and mind, I say I, when I'm talking about myself, and I have a name, Sangye Khadro. I actually have 2 names, Kathleen McDonald, that my parents gave me, and Sangye Khadro that my lamas gave me. So that's what the I is. It's just what is labeled, what is named to this set of aggregates. And it's the same for everybody else. Everyone else has their own set of aggregates, and they are labeled, whatever their name may be. And each person says I in relation to their own set of aggregates. So that's how a person exists conventionally. But don't worry if you find that difficult to understand. It is difficult to understand. And in fact, this might make you feel better. It says that in order to understand how things exist conventionally, we have to first realize emptiness. So it's only after we realize emptiness that we can understand, really understand how things exist conventionally. So it's like conventional existence is more difficult to understand than emptiness. Because our mind is like clouded. Our mind is veiled from being able to see how things do exist conventionally. We our mind superimposes inherent existence onto everything. We see everything as if they are inherently existing rather than just labeled, merely labeled. And so it's this veil of projected inherent existence that prevents us from seeing the reality of things, how things are just labeled onto their parts, basis of imputation. So it's only after we realize emptiness, we're able to clear away that veil, that false projection onto things, that we can see things as they really are, how they are just labeled, they're merely labeled. So really understanding conventional existence is not easy. Okay, so to continue, the next point, 3 levels of selflessness of person. So as I said before, we are advised to start our exploration of emptiness by focusing on our own self, I, me. And this was actually kind of a hot topic in India at the time of the Buddha. Probably before the Buddha, there were lots of different teachers, spiritual teachers, philosophical teachers. Many of them were meditators. They engaged in meditation, and they were exploring all kinds of questions like, what is the self? What is the I? And, does it really exist or not? Is there a self or not? And if it does exist, what kind of properties does it have? What kind of characteristics does it have? So this was something that was being explored by many people at the time of the Buddha. And some of these meditators got quite deep into meditation, such that they were able to see their past lives. They were able to remember past lives, their own past lives. They could also see other people's past lives. And they could also see the future. They could see that, after we die, there is rebirth. And so this led them to wonder, well, what is it that goes from life to life? And also karma, like you create karma in one lifetime, and then it becomes the cause for experiences in another lifetime. So there's got to be something to explain this transference of karma from one life to another. And so they came up with the idea of a self or a soul, Atman. I think the term in Sanskrit, Atman. Some part of a person that continues to exist after death, doesn't die, continues to exist, and brings with it the karma that was created in the past, brings that karma from one life to the next, and then takes rebirth. So Buddha probably learned this view because he did study with some contemporary spiritual teachers of his time. And he surpassed his teachers in terms of his experiences. You know, he studied what they taught him, practiced what they taught him, but then became dissatisfied because he realized that what he was looking for was the end of suffering, the way to end suffering and the causes of suffering. So even though he mastered what he had learned from his teachers, he recognized he still wasn't free from suffering. There was still a cause of suffering in the mind. So then he went off on his own and did his own exploration, his own meditation. And what he came to understand was that there is no such thing as this Atman or soul that has certain qualities like permanence that was taught by these teachers. So he realized that's just a fantasy, a fabrication of the mind. It doesn't really exist. He could see that in his own experience. He also recognized that believing in that kind of a self or soul or Atman was a cause of suffering. That belief in that kind of self keeps us in samsara, in cyclic existence. So he saw through that mistaken idea of a real self or soul or Atman, became free of that, realized the selflessness, the absence of that, and in that way was able to free himself from suffering. So this whole topic then of selflessness or absence of a self is unique to Buddhism. I think there's no other system of religion or philosophy anywhere in the world that teaches this doctrine of selflessness. But then there are actually different levels of selflessness. And usually my experience is when Tibetan lamas teach the topic of emptiness, they go straight to the subtlest one, the emptiness of inherent existence. They kind of skip over the others. But one of my teachers, Geshe Jama Tekcho, Tensor Jama Tekcho, he did talk about these different levels. And I found that extremely helpful to start with a more coarse level of selflessness and then gradually go to a more subtle one. So that's what I'm going to do here. So we'll start with the very coarse one. And this is the emptiness of a permanent Unitarian independent self. So this is the kind of self or soul that is believed in, was and still is nowadays believed in by certain Indian philosophical systems. For example, the Samkhya, there's one Indian school called Samkhya. So they actually assert this. This is part of their philosophy. They say everyone has this kind of self or soul or Atman, which has these qualities of permanence and being unitary and independent. So the bullet points explain the meaning of the terms. Permanent in Buddhism means unchanging, doesn't change. But I think in their case, it also has the sense of existing forever. You know, it will continue to exist forever. And the second is unitary, meaning one whole thing, not made of parts. So you can't divide it up into parts. It's like monolithic, partless. So that's another quality they attribute to this self or soul. And the third one is independent, which means not depending on causes and conditions. So that's something else they say about this soul. It's not affected by other things, causes and conditions. It can't be affected by other things. Yeah. So this kind of self or soul, if it did exist, Buddhism says it doesn't, but if it did exist, then it would be unchanging, not divisible into parts, and not dependent on causes and conditions. And in addition, it would be something separate from our body and mind. Because they say that when a person dies, the body is left behind to be cremated or buried or whatever. And then the mental experiences that a person has with their, especially with the five senses, seeing, hearing, and so on. So those are also left behind, or they're no longer existing when we die. And so it's only this permanent, unitary, independent self or soul or Atman that continues to exist and takes rebirth. So it carries the karma from this life to future lives. And yeah, so they believe in that. So this is refuted by all Buddhist schools. All the Buddhist schools would reject this kind of self. Now, it's good for us to look at this because some of us may have been raised in a religion. I know I was. And we were taught that we have a soul. We use the word soul in Christianity, and I think also in Judaism. And that this soul will continue to exist after we die. And then depending on how we behave during our life, if we were good, then our soul will go to heaven. But if we were bad, if we committed sins, then our soul will go to hell. And then our soul will stay in those two places, one of those two places forever, for all eternity. I found that pretty disturbing as a child, the possibility of going to hell and not having a second chance. So that's terrible. And also, I think many people who believe in a soul and heaven and hell and so forth, they also have this idea of being reunited with their deceased loved ones when they go to heaven. You've probably heard that idea, you know, like your spouse dies, your parents die, but you comfort yourself saying, never mind, we will meet again in heaven, and there we will be together forever and ever and enjoy our relationships. Although one person, I heard one person say that for him, being reunited with his family forever is not heaven, that's hell. Yeah. But anyway, some people think it's a wonderful idea, a wonderful thought to be together with your family, your friends, and so forth in heaven forever and ever. That's a wonderful idea. And so that kind of idea does show there's this sense of a self, a me, and also other people as something kind of fixed and permanent. So even after death, I will continue to exist. The I of this lifetime will continue to exist, and I will meet my mother and I will meet my father, and we'll recognize each other. And I don't know, we might even look the same. Maybe we have transparent bodies, but we still look the same. I'll see my mother. Oh, that's my mother there, and that's my father, right? So people do have that notion. So that does show, this idea of a kind of fixed, unchanging, permanent self or person that continues to exist after death. So I think it is good for us to explore this idea. And the Buddha did say, we need to investigate. He said that about his teachings, but he says that about all teachings, any kind of spiritual teachings that we encounter. We shouldn't just blindly believe just because lots of people believe in them, or they're written down in an ancient holy book. That isn't enough to say, oh, this must be true. But we need to use our own intelligence, our wisdom, and investigate to see if these things are true or not. So I think it's useful for us, because even if we moved away from the religion that we were raised in, and or exploring other religions, there might still be some lingering belief, because what we learn when we're small children does stay with us. It's very strongly imprinted in our mind. So we might still have some remnant of that belief in our mind. And so it is good to explore this idea. So I plan to we could do a meditation on this, but because we're almost halfway point, maybe it would be best to take a little break first, and then we'll come back and do the meditation. So let's have a 5-minute break, and then we'll do meditation on this. So I hope everyone is back. Can't see everyone. Yeah, so I can see in the, hey Tracy, I can see in the chat box a question from Phoebe about inherent existence and the meaning of permanence. So I will get to the explanation of inherent existence later. It's actually the third of the 3 types of selflessness. So let's leave that until later. But the term permanence, since we're already using it now, in Buddhism, there is a lot of talk about permanent versus impermanent. And the meaning in Buddhism isn't exactly the same as how we use those terms in English, for example. So in Buddhism, impermanent means changing, subject to change, constant. It's not just occasionally things change, but they're changing constantly, every tiny fraction of moment. And impermanent things are also things that arise from causes and conditions. They come into existence depending on other things, causes and conditions. So our body, for example, it's a good example of an impermanent thing. It comes from our parents' bodies, elements from their bodies come together and produce this body. And right from the first moment, that zygote, fertilized egg, is constantly changing, growing and transforming and developing into a fetus, and then into a baby, and now it's an adult, and so on. So our body is constantly changing and arises from causes and conditions. Now, permanent, the meaning of permanent is the opposite. A permanent thing doesn't change moment by moment. It stays the same one moment to the next. And also it doesn't arise from causes and conditions. It's not produced or arising from causes and conditions. So you might think, well, what's nothing is like that. There are things that are permanent, at least according to the Geluk tradition. I don't know if all Buddhists would agree, but I got fuzzy there. I have to fix my fuzziness. Emptiness. Emptiness is a permanent phenomena. Now, That's not easy to understand, but it will come clear later. But emptiness is something that doesn't change moment by moment, and it doesn't arise from causes and conditions. It's not brought into existence by putting together various causes and conditions. But it does exist. It's something that can be known, something that can be experienced. Another example of a permanent phenomena is cessation, the third noble truth. Cessation, true cessation means when a particular affliction, delusion in the mind, or even just part of it, has been eliminated completely such that it will never arise again. That's the meaning of a cessation. So it's an absence of that particular delusion. And that does exist, something that can be experienced. So they're kind of abstract. Permanent phenomena are more abstract things, not tangible things that are visible and touchable, and you can't put them under a microscope and study them, but they do exist because they can be known. We have to develop our mind to be able to know them, but they can be known. So anyway, that's just the meaning of permanent and impermanent. Matt, you have a question?
Yes, Venerable, thank you. You were saying that in Buddhism, impermanence means constantly changing. So is the mind, or I'm specifically thinking of single-pointed concentration, there seems to be a contradiction there. I'm sure I'm not understanding the subtlety of something, but if you achieve single-pointed concentration or focus, isn't that a permanent? I guess I don't know, you know what I mean? Because it's kind of implied that you can control that and stay there as long as you want, right?
Yeah, the mind, according to Buddhism, mind itself is impermanent. It's nature. The very nature of the mind is that it's changing all the time. Each moment we have like a new mind arising, and that lasts only a moment, and then it ceases, and then the next one arises, and that ceases, and the next one arises, and that ceases, and so on. So even a person who has single-pointed concentration, like samadhi or calm abiding, and they're able to keep their mind focused on their object of meditation for a period of time, even hours, their mind is still changing. You know, they have one moment of mind focused on their object, and that ceases. The next moment of mind focuses on the object, and that ceases. So even though their mind is remaining concentrated single-pointedly on one object, it's still changing within that. And the object is changing too, unless the object is emptiness. But if your object is the breath, or your object is the image of a Buddha, that too is impermanent. So that's changing. So even though the mind is changing and the object is changing, the mind continues to stay focused on that object and doesn't wander through other objects. Okay. I mean, that's how it's described. I haven't really experienced that. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I'll leave the other questions until later, because I did want to lead this meditation before we run out of time. So I thought to lead a meditation on this idea of a permanent, unitary, independent self, just to explore if we do have those kind of notions about ourself. And if we do, is it realistic? Is it really possible for there to be such a thing? So make yourselves comfortable. Try to keep your back straight, because that helps the mind to be more focused and awake and alert. And spend a few minutes being aware of your breathing, coming in and going out, to settle your mind in the present and leave aside other thoughts. Okay, so we're going to investigate this notion of a self or soul that is permanent in the sense of being unchanging and continuing to exist after death. The same person we are now will still be there after we die. And also having those other two qualities of being unitary or partless and independent. We'll start with the first quality of permanence, being permanent, unchanging. So just check to see if you do have that sense of a permanent, unchanging self, I, me. For example, we do say things like, when I was a child. So that might indicate a sense that the I of today, the I that's sitting here right now, is the same as the I when we were a young child. Does that make sense? Is that reasonable to think that there's this permanent, unchanging I that continues to exist all through our life? And if you do think there is such a thing as a permanent, unchanging I, ask yourself, what is it? Is there something you can find within your body, mind combination, your aggregates, that you can point to as being that permanent, unchanging I? So you may have found something, or maybe you're still looking, but we'll move on to the next point, the next quality of this kind of soul believed in by the non-Buddhists. The second quality is being unitary, meaning without parts. You can't break it down into parts. So does your sense of I, me, myself, have that quality? Does it seem to be one whole, monolithic, partless thing? And if so, we should be able to point to it. We should be able to find something within our body or within our mind that we can point to and say, that is this I. It's whole, partless. So it's clear with our body that it's made up of parts, and the parts are made of parts, and so on down to the tiniest particles like molecules and atoms, and even those can be broken down further. Scientists haven't been able to find anything that's like the basic building block of matter. So you just get down to this very subtle level where there's a lot of space and very weird things going on. So in terms of our body, we can't really find anything in our body that is partless, that can't be broken down further. Mind is more difficult because we can't see the mind. Buddhism says our mind has parts too. One way we can understand that is that it's constantly changing. Each moment of time, there are new thoughts or perceptions or feelings arising, and they immediately pass, disappear, and the next one arises, and then that passes, and the next one arises, and that passes. So there's nothing in our mind that is kind of fixed and permanent and unchanging and can't be broken down into parts. Now let's look at the third quality of independence in the sense of not depending on causes and conditions. So if our I, ourself, wasn't dependent on causes and conditions, that means we would not have depended on our parents giving birth to us, raising us, taking care of us when we were small. We would not depend on food and water and air and medicine. And we would not be affected by anything. No matter what happens, what kind of experiences we encounter, they wouldn't affect us. We would be always the same, unchanging, unaffected by anything. So does that make sense? Does it make sense that there could be a self or an I that is like that? So the non-Buddhists who believe in this permanent, unitary, independent soul or Atman also believe that it's the thing that creates karma in one life and then experiences the results of karma in another life. But if something really is permanent, meaning unchanging and partless, not depending on causes and conditions, how could such a thing do anything? How could it do actions? Because in order to do an action, one has to change, one has to move your body, move your mind, move your speech. So something that's permanent wouldn't be able to move or change in order to create karma. And also, when the results of karma occur, then a person experiences either suffering as a result of bad karma or happiness as a result of good karma. But again, how could a permanent, unitary, independent self experience happiness and suffering? Because that requires change. Some change takes place, and you go from a neutral state to a happy state or to a suffering state. So there's contradictions in this notion of a permanent, unitary, independent self being that which creates karma and then goes to the next life, future lives, and experiences the results of karma. And just check your own ideas about this. If you have reached any kind of conclusion about the possibility of this kind of self or soul, or you might feel you want to think about it more, explore it more. So bring your meditation to some kind of conclusion based on what you've understood. So you may have felt that wasn't really enough time to really explore those questions, but you can do it on your own. You can continue thinking about those points on your own. And one thing I came to when I was in the past learning about and thinking about this idea, I saw that I do have a sense of permanence, and I think we all do. Like I said, we think when I was a child, when I was 20, and there is a sense of the I of right now is the same as the I back then. I am the same person. And then when we imagine the future, when I'm older, when I'm dying and so forth, we have those kinds of thoughts. There's again the sense of this I who's here today is going to be having those kinds of experiences in the future. And so I asked one of my teachers, I explained this to one of my teachers, and I said, so does that mean I have this kind of belief in a permanent, unitary, independent self? And he said, no. In the case of these non-Buddhists, they believe in all three of those qualities, that it's permanent and unitary and independent of causes and conditions. So it's not just permanent, but the other two qualities as well. And they, they actively believe in it and teach it, assert it, and so on. So having a sense of permanence, of being the same person all through one's life isn't this one, but that's actually part of the more subtle levels of selflessness. So it is a tricky question. I mean, Buddhism says there is a continuation, like this body we have now is a continuation of the body we had in the past, all the way back to the zygote in our mother's womb, the very beginning of this body. There is a continuation. Yeah, it's the continuation of those past bodies. It's not exactly the same, though. Definitely, obviously, a lot of changes have taken place, and it's changing all the time. I heard once they say that the cells in our body, we have a completely new set of cells every 11 years. I don't know if that's correct or not. I think there are some cells that live longer than that. But anyway, there are changes taking place all the time in our body. So considering that, you cannot say the body is exactly the same as it was even yesterday, much less, in childhood or in the womb. But it's the continuation. It's the continuation of that body. And it's similar with our mind. Our mind is also changing all the time, every second, but it's still this continuation. That's why we have memories. I can remember when I was 5 years old and I did such and such. So there is, in a way, the same mind in the sense of the continuum of that mind, but it's not exactly the same. The mind when I was 5 years old and my mind now are different, thank goodness. And even yesterday, and even 5 minutes ago, there's changes taking place in our mind all the time. And yet, it's still the same kind of continuum. And so, based on that, it's kind of conventionally, we can say, yeah, I am the same person as I was in the past. But then when we analyze that carefully, we really investigate that, we can't find anything that's really the same, exactly the same. But that's part of our conventional existence, our I, me, Sangye, Khadro, Kathleen McDonald is really just labeled onto this constantly changing collection of physical and mental components or aggregates. Okay, so conventionally, we say that, and that's fine. That we're kind of, communicating with each other, talking with each other. It's fine to say, oh, when I was 5 years old. But yeah, ideally we understand that within that, there's a lot of changes taking place. So this notion of a permanent, unitary, independent self or soul is not something innate. It's not something everybody has. We're not born with it, but it's something acquired by learning a philosophy or a religion that teaches that kind of self. Whereas the other two, the coarse and the subtle levels of selflessness, those are addressing notions of a self or an I that are innate, that are found in the minds of everybody. So maybe I'll just start talking about the next one on the list, if you put the slides back up. Now, I will leave some, well, we're getting close to the end. I'll just talk a little bit about this one, and then next week we can do a meditation on it. And I will leave some time for questions. So number 2 is coarse. This is a coarse level of selflessness. And it's the emptiness of a self-supporting, substantially existent self. So there's a whole bunch of words there that are probably unfamiliar, sound very technical, but there's an explanation. So self-supporting, the meaning of self-supporting means that it's somewhat independent of the aggregates, not totally, but a little bit independent of the aggregates, able to kind of stand on its own, support itself. The second term, substantially existent, this is a term that comes up in Buddhist philosophy. It's a little complicated, but I gave some examples that will hopefully help. So the meaning of substantially existent is something that's able to appear to the mind without other things having to appear. So an example would be a tree as opposed to a forest. A tree is said by some Buddhist schools, it's said to be substantially existent because we can just look at a tree and the tree will appear to us. We don't have to look at something else. We don't have to see something else in order to see a tree. We just have to see the tree itself. And then on the other hand, a forest, we say, I'm going for a walk in the forest, or we have a forest in our backyard or something like that. Yeah. But what does it mean to see a forest? In order to see a forest, do we actually see a forest? Is a forest something we can see? What we're actually seeing are trees, a whole bunch of trees. A single tree isn't a forest. Okay, so there's this group of trees that are all growing in a particular area, fairly close together. And then we give the name forest. We have the label forest to that group of trees. And that's what a forest is. So it's just labeled, just a name given to a group of trees. Does that make sense? So the Buddhism would say a forest is not substantially existent because in order to see a forest, we have to see things that are not a forest. In other words, trees. We have to see trees, and trees are not a forest. An individual tree, this tree isn't a forest, and that tree isn't a forest, and that tree isn't a forest, and that tree isn't a forest. So maybe you have 100 trees, each of which isn't a forest. Okay, so a tree isn't a forest. So we see trees, and then we say, oh, there's a forest there. But we can't actually see the forest without the appearance of trees, which are not a forest. Another example would be a star as opposed to a constellation. Okay, so we can look up in the sky at night and see stars. We can see individual stars. Then human beings also have this thing of making constellations. Okay, so there's this particular group of stars that have a certain shape, like the Big Dipper. Yeah, it looks like a pot with a handle. So we call that the Big Dipper. But in order to see the Big Dipper, we have to see stars. And individual stars are not a constellation. So it's only a group of stars in a particular place, in a particular configuration, that we then give that label, a constellation, like the Big Dipper or Scorpio or whatever. So anyway, the meaning of substantially existent is that it's able to appear on its own without having to see other things. So that's a little technical, but anyway, let's look at what this means. The paragraph under that says, the notion of such a self is that it's like the ruler of the aggregates. It controls the body and mind. So it's said that this notion of self is something everybody has. Even babies, even animals have this sense of a self. It seems to be something like a ruler, like a boss, like a director inside of ourselves and ruling or controlling, managing our body and mind. So you may have noticed that. Have you ever noticed that? Like I am in charge, and I'm going to make my body do this, and I'm going to make my mind do that. The thing that makes decisions. Yeah. So that sense of self is this one. So it doesn't appear to be completely separate from the aggregates. Like the previous one, the permanent unitary independent self, that one seems to be independent, separate from the aggregates. So this one doesn't. It seems to, it's like it's in there somewhere among the aggregates, not totally separate, but still having this little bit superior position so that it can be the boss, the director. So one analogy that they use is like a head salesperson in a group of salespersons. So for example, if there's a real estate office and there's 10 people and they're all real estate agents doing the same work, but one of them is like the boss. One of them is, started the business and hired the others and pays them salary. I don't know how it works, but anyway, that kind of thing. So the head salesperson is also a real estate agent. They do the same work as the others, but they're still in this little bit superior position. So this sense of self, the last sentence says, it seems that the aggregates depend on the I, but the I doesn't depend on the aggregates. So that's the way it appears, how the I appears in relation to the aggregates. It's a little bit above and superior in a controlling position, and the aggregates depend on the I, but the I, doesn't depend on the aggregates. So that's how it's described, the description of this sense of self. So what we need to do is look for it in our experience. Try to notice, try to detect. And we'll do this next week. We'll do a meditation on this. The last bit, I can just read that too. There are two forms of this conception of a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. One is innate. This means that everyone has it, even babies and animals. So we have it from past lives. In fact, beginningless time, from beginningless time, as long as our mind has been existing, then it has always, there's always been this notion, this conception of this kind of I. And so we inherited it from our past lives. We're born with it. So the second one is acquired. This is acquired through studying tenets that teach the existence of such a self. So on top of this innate one, it's also possible that, some people study philosophy or religion that teaches that such a self exists. They really do have this kind of self. And so that sort of further concretizes that innate sense of self. But even if we don't study that kind of philosophy, we still have it innately. And so Buddhism says this kind of self doesn't actually exist. It's a mistake. It's fabrication of the mind, but we have to investigate it. We have to go through a process of investigating it, seeing if it exists or not. So this sense of self is more coarse than the third one, which is the emptiness of an inherently existing self. That's much more subtle, much more difficult to detect. So that's why, again, I think it makes sense to work on the coarser one first, because realistically, we can't realize the emptiness of an inherently existing self if we're still believing in or grasping to this more coarse level of self. Does that make sense? So I think it's helpful to go through that process. Okay, so I'll stop there, and I can see Heather has her hand up. Or is that a mistake? You have a question?
I was just going to share that during the meditation, something that came up here in the States. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving, and I do work on being aware of an inherently existing self. And what occurred to me is how the dynamics of a Thanksgiving dinner that just goes out the window, that as soon as we sit down, I'm no longer a 50-year-old woman. I'm a 12-year-old who's jealous that my brother is my mother's favorite. So it was actually a really nice stroke of serendipity that you were talking about this, so I could keep that in mind. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah. That's so that means you could have an opportunity of just checking that sense of self. I mean, that's what they recommend when we our sense of I, real, whether it's substantially existent or the inherently existing I, but it's not always easy to recognize. Sometimes it's just kind of quiet and doesn't make much trouble. But at times when we get emotional, when emotions come up, both negative emotions like getting angry or feeling hurt or outraged or whatever, defensive and so on, all those kind of disturbing emotions. So in those moments, the sense of self or I, it becomes much more obvious. It's like behind or beneath this emotion, there seems to be an I who's feeling that emotion. The emotion itself, that does exist. That's part of our mind. So anger exists, jealousy exists, depression exists. So all those different emotions are aspects of our mind. They do exist, and they can be triggered off by different kinds of circumstances, things that people say and do, or just by thinking of things that can trigger off emotions. So those do exist. But in addition to that, we have a sense of an I who is feeling that emotion. So that's the thing we're trying to look for. What is that? Yes, that emotion is there, but what is this I who's feeling that way? So that's actually a really good opportunity to recognize this false sense of self, false sense of I. That's actually the first step in understanding emptiness. We have to be able to recognize how we do believe in, or at least we, have this habit of seeing a real I. So we have to recognize that, and then we apply reasonings to check if it exists or not, if it really does exist or not. So maybe you could try doing that when you're at your Thanksgiving dinner. But the sense of I can also come up when we have more, I don't know if positive is the right word, but happy emotions, like getting excited, somebody praising us, complimenting us, we win something, we do really well at something, and we feel, oh, I did a good job. So again, in those moments, there's also a sense of a I behind those emotions, a real solid I. The problem is when we're caught up in those emotions, it's very difficult to have the presence of mind to say, oh, I have to look at that I have to investigate that I. But later, afterwards, after the whole thing is passed, then we can sit down and meditate and try to remember that experience and look for that I. So I see there's some questions in the chat box. One of the students asked if there were specific sections of the readings you would recommend they read. Readings, I'm not sure what you mean by readings. I mean, the only thing I sent was this outline, which I'm going through now.
I apologize. There's a Tupten Norberling included the Discovering Buddhism reader as a link on the website.
Right, I forgot. That's right, I forgot about that. Yeah, I'm not that familiar with all those readings. And mean, my understanding is that when we teach Discovering Buddhism modules, we can do it in our own way. We don't have to do it exactly according to what was recommended. So I'll have a look at those later. And I did, I think I did remember in the past reading through those materials, and I felt that some of them were quite advanced and not so introductory level. And based on my own experience, trying to read advanced explanations of emptiness before I was really ready for it, and I just felt really lost. So I try to keep things simple in plain English. So yeah, I mean, feel free to read those if you wish, and I think they are required if you want to complete this module, and as part of the Discovering Buddhism course. So I think you are required to read those modules. I mean, so it's those materials. But yeah, I'll have a look at them later, and then I can send you an email about that. So then Tracy asks, since we have a remnant of even gross sense of self, would it be productive to try to find each during meditation? Maybe see if coarser or dominating at times? So do you mean that when we're meditating, we should just try to look for our sense of self and see whatever is the strongest one and what the properties of it are? Is that what you mean?
I guess, is it productive to try to tease them apart? Because sometimes I'm sitting there thinking, well, which one is this? Maybe I'm just over categorizing, or
I think that's a good question. Because like I say, the Tibetan lamas, when they teach, they usually, I got all fuzzy again. When they teach, they usually start talking about emptiness of inherent existence right from the beginning. And they ask us to look for that sense of self, the sense of an inherently existing self. And I always found that kind of difficult to do when trying to look at myself. It's just so confusing in there. And then what I came to is that, and I've learned this from my teachers and asked questions and so forth, that in reality, we cannot recognize the inherently existing self before we have recognized the more gross levels of self. So they say, for example, they say when we are searching for the sense of self, like trying to remember a time when you got really upset and look for the I at that moment. And if you do manage to get a sense of that I who was upset, it's probably the coarser one. It's probably the self-sufficient, substantially existent self rather than the inherently existing one. Because that one is so much, I think it's the way I think of it, it's actually like buried beneath. It's buried beneath the coarser one. And I actually came up with this analogy of Russian dolls, Russian dolls. I even have a photo. I have a photo of the Russian dolls, the bigger, smaller down to the tiniest one. So that's the way I think of our sense of self. It's like the tiniest Russian doll that you can't take apart anymore. That's like the conventional self, the I that does exist, because we do have an I there. It's something quite subtle, but it does exist. So that's the I that does exist. But then that one is kind of hidden inside of another one that's a little bit bigger. And that one would be the inherently existing self, meaning that we kind of cover the existing self, the self that does exist, with this layer of an inherently existing self. Yeah, our mind projects inherent existence onto the self that does exist. So the subtler one, the one that does exist, is actually hidden inside of this grosser one. the inherently existing one. But then that one in turn is hidden inside of another one that's just a little bit bigger. And that would be the self-sufficient, substantially existent self. And then that in turn might be, but not necessarily for everybody, hidden under another one, the permanent unitary independent self or soul, like many Christians believe. So that's like a bigger one that covers the smaller one. And then there's even coarser levels of self, more like just the notions we have about I am American, I am female, I am gay, I am a nun, I'm a Buddhist, I'm a Hindu, you know, all these other ideas we have about ourselves that we acquire during our life, you know, as we grow up within a particular family, in a particular country and religion and so on. We kind of add on even more layers of I onto what's there. So that's why I thought the idea of a Russian doll is helpful for me anyway. And so I think when we're looking for our sense of self, we'll probably just notice the more gross levels. And only in time will we gradually be able to get to the more subtle ones and eventually the subtlest one, which is the inherently existing I. So I think we just work with whatever appears to us, you know, whatever sense of self we can notice, and then just ask ourselves, what is that self? What is it? What kind of qualities does it have? Yeah, so just explore that on your own. Does it really exist? Is it really there or not? It's a very difficult process. I mean, I'm still very much a beginner at this, still struggling to understand it after so many years. So it's not easy. But any effort we make to try to understand it is very valuable. Okay, so we have time for one more question. Matt?
Oh, so Venerable, in your smallest Russian doll analogy, does that smallest Russian doll exist inherently then?
No. And remember, this is just my own idea. If I were to talk to a Tibetan Lama about that, they may say, oh, no, that's not right at all. It's just something I came up with on my own to help me make sense of all of this. So my own idea is that the smallest Russian doll is the conventionally existing I, the I that does exist. And that I definitely doesn't exist inherently. It's only what is labeled.
Right.
You know, the merely labeled I, the merely labeled Kathleen or Sangye Khadro or Matt or Heather, just the merely labeled I onto whatever aggregates we have. But again, to understand that, what that means, what it means to be merely labeled is not easy. And we do have to really understand it, we have to first realize emptiness.
Okay.
So that's how I think of that analogy, that there is an I deep down inside at the bottom, underneath all these layers of false I's. But no, definitely it's not inherently existing. In fact, Lama Zopa Rinpoche once said that it's barely there. It's almost not existing. It does exist, but almost not existing. Just barely there. So yeah, this whole topic is quite mind-bending and sometimes frustrating, but yeah, it's still very valuable, very precious, and we're very fortunate that we have the chance to learn about it and explore it, try to understand it. So that brings us to the end of our time. So let's conclude by dedicating the merit, the positive energy. So remember the motivation we had at the beginning of wanting to benefit other people, other beings, all sentient beings if possible. So now we're dedicating the merit, sharing the merit with all living beings, that it will bring them peace and happiness and ultimately enlightenment. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-fulfilling, wish-granting jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers, honoring the three sublime ones, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. So thank you. And for those who are celebrating Thanksgiving tomorrow, I hope it goes well for you. You have a wonderful, warm, loving experience with family and friends. See you next week.
Thank you.